Great. Petroculturists, welcome. This house was built in 1875. You might have heard that it was the largest place of worship in the country until much later than that. I think the number of people they've actually counted who filled it were 2,262. Today, since about a quarter century ago, it has been serving other purposes. And you've had a couple of good afternoons, good mornings here. Thanks for turning out on a Saturday. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing someone who started her academic career about 20 years ago with a degree in biochemical sciences in 2002 from Cambridge, Massachusetts, from Harvard University. She then moved across the pond, as we call it, to take a master's in international relations at the London School of Economics. And she worked alongside on strategic intelligence with a firm called Strategic Analysis. She worked as a political correspondent, including for the Panama City News Herald. She's also the mother of 2 preteens, and then took a PhD from Johns Hopkins in Baltimore in 2016. Moved down to Tampa for a year for a postdoc at the University of South Florida, and has since 2017 been at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. So this is a bit of a geography moving up and down the east coast of the US. Today we welcome you to the west coast of Norway. Cara Daggett is going to talk to us about some of the themes she's most interested in, which include energy politics, include feminism, include history. And today she will take us through a keynote talk on renewable masculinities. Petroculturists, give it up for Cara Daggett.
Okay, am I on? Yes. Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. It was, you got to see some of my sort of pre-academic life as a reporter and all kinds of things. And I think some of those feed into my research. And I'd like to start by saying how honored I am to be asked to speak at Petrocultures. I think this is the most fun conference that I have. This is my second one, and I think these are the most fun conferences I've been to. So thank you to Britt and Catalina and Victoria and Jordan for inviting me. Today I'm going to talk about energy and masculinity. It can be hard to talk about masculinity, although there's a lot of public awareness that masculinity has something to do with climate change, that there is actually something sexy, contra this work of art, about petro-modernity, though it's usually treated in a jokey way, like men behaving badly, rather than as a more systemic problem, which has been what my research is trying to do. So we have the toxic masculinity of people like Elon Musk, which is so obvious as to be a caricature. So we have this nice, Houston, we have a problem, and it's the patriarchy. This is the Tesla image going to Mars. And Tesla's not the only one who dreams of expansion into outer space. We have Jeff Bezos. And the space rocket available as a sex toy with very few modifications. I'm picking really easy examples, but these dreams of sexy technological salvation appear in mainstream energy and climate policy making. I think it's safe to say they're dominant, if not always with so much phallic obviousness. So I first became interested in masculinity when I was thinking about the far right in the US. As a white woman living now in Appalachia, which is a former coal region, and with most of my family in Texas, which is where this picture is from, I wanted to emphasize the relationship between the almost ubiquitous misogyny of the right and their defense of fossil fuels. So, for example, with petro-masculinity, I insist that the fight over abortion rights is indeed part of and related to energy and climate politics. And gender anxiety will continue to slither alongside climate anxiety in terms of the kinds of political affect that it produces. So masculinities are always multiple, with ongoing struggles over which masculine identity might become dominant or hegemonic in any context. And with that hegemony comes the denigration of femininities and queerness as lack, as other. And when I think about petro-masculinity, I use Anna Agathangelou and Lily Ling, who are two feminist IR scholars, and they wrote about hypermasculinity after 9/11 in the US as a, quote, reactionary stance that arises when a hegemonic masculinity feels threatened and then needs to exaggerate their masculinity as a result. Those threats also generate a desire for authoritarianism, I argued, for order to be exerted upon a chaotic, feminized nature. And so my talk today is going to be a continuation of that study of mastery, a logic of domination. I feel compelled to keep trying to understand this logic, first to put it into historical context, to refuse its own claims to represent universal human nature. Second, to find its weak spots, so sort of a strategic analysis. And third, because of something Oksana also mentioned yesterday, quoting Benjamin, that fascism is not just about privileged elites, but also popular affect. Fascism can capture revolutionary energy while still protecting property. So in that sense, I think with Foucault, who famously wrote of fascism as a broader psychological phenomenon, less as a fringe group of super violent henchmen, which it also is, more as a potentiality that exists in all publics. So he says, quote, the strategic adversary is fascism, the fascism in us all, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, to desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. It's too easy to be anti-fascist on the molar level and not even see the fascist inside you, the fascist you yourself sustain and nourish and cherish with molecules both personal and collective, end quote. So to think about masculinity and energy is also to talk about the erotics of energy, not just fossil fuels, that compels broader publics. And here's where my talk's going to go today, not only on the right. There's this kind of fascist potential among liberals, but also I think in the left. And today I want to expand this argument about petro-masculinity to think about so-called renewable masculinities, and go beyond oil and even late modernity to think more broadly about authoritarian desire, masculinity, and energy, how they connect. Many people, dare I say most people, have felt the erotic charge of oil and energy technology. I know I have, like the vibration of a motorcycle between your legs or the romance of a road trip. And in the US, white women have historically joined petro-patriarchs, drawn by the appeal of white authoritarians. So while I am talking a lot about white masculinity today, I'm talking about intersections of privilege and power and how they map onto all kinds of bodies and things. And one place we see this, and I was really thrilled to hear more about this from our Canadian researchers this week, is in right-wing protests. On the left is a Black Lives Matter group, and on the right is the Freedom Convoy. So trucks and yachts are now ubiquitous in these protests, and it's really interesting to see the discrepancy between the trucks and yachts and the Black Lives Matter or women's rights or climate protesters who are on foot in the street. This is a multi-sensory buffet. The noise of engines, the sickly exhaust, the vibrations all become an expression of violent jouissance. In these protests, the violence of fossil fuels is not a matter of political shame. Fossil fuels are embraced precisely because they are violent. They promise power for those who might otherwise feel impotent. So I've had the opportunity to speak a lot about petro-masculinity, and the question that I get almost every time and that I want to think more about today was this. People notice that masculinity is rife, not just on the far right, but as I showed in the opening slides, among techno-optimists and liberal centrists too, and dare I say, on the left. Here are just two other very easy and egregious examples. This is the Hummer EV and marketing about the Tesla Cybertruck. Both are marketed to reassure consumers that masculinity can and will be preserved and renewed and augmented by EV. Both are also purposefully seductive, doubling down on the erotics of domination and militarization to counteract the way green practices are often feminized. So Marcus Geisler, who's a professor of marketing, calls this Tesla man, almost like Iron Man, combines rugged individualism, entrepreneurial can-do spirit, and a seemingly unshakable faith in markets with a sensible care for nature, the planet, and future generations. And Martin Holtman has called this ecomodern masculinity, which I think will be taking over Stavanger next week. Noticing these two dominant styles of energy masculinity, one an intense fossil masculinity and the other eco-modern, cool and high-tech, smooth and clean. The question I get is, how are they related to each other? It's an important question, and I think it's too easy to dismiss as just boys with their toys. It speaks to the hope that there are powerful elites who may not be as attached to fossil fuels and who could help lead the way to a green transition, who could be kind of partners even if we don't completely like or agree with them. So this is the hope that toxic masculinity itself could be rerouted towards something more generative. And this hope was recently expressed by Bill McKibben in a piece about the emissions of money in banks. Corporations like Apple or Facebook tout their progress in decreasing emissions, but at the same time, they're parking all their assets in banks that loan money to fund fossil fuel projects. And McKibben sees this as an opportunity. Perhaps big tech could use its wealth to pressure big money to turn against big oil. So for example, Apple could tell the bank, Morgan Stanley could say, we're going to remove our money unless you stop funding new fossil fuel extraction. And McKibben says this could be a turning point in the crisis. So big tech, big money, big oil, they're all doused in ecomodern and petro-masculinity. And given time constraints, I'm going to kind of lump big money into big tech, but I think it has a misogynist subculture all its own that I'm researching right now. But I'm really interested in this idea that big tech and big oil are antagonists that could work against each other. Certainly their aesthetic styles and the kinds of technology they love are sometimes worlds apart, one touting coal and oil, the dirtier, the noisier, the better, and the other embracing this kind of shiny, smooth green and shiny, smooth as a gold coin future. I think we saw this a little bit in the idea that money would be the new oil, as I think Graham put it so succinctly last night in terms of Norway's future. One wants to return women to the patriarchal home, and the other at least pretends to be okay with liberal feminism. But at the same time, these both have strong misogynistic tendencies, and both approach the more than human world as something that's best controlled and used. So I think most of us in this little room are critical of both, and yet I know from my partner who works more in policy spaces that this eco-modern masculinity is ubiquitous in climate policy circles. And as I will suggest, its underlying affective relationship to energy also appears among leftists. So it's worth taking this question seriously about their political relationship. And one good way that I could do this would be to dissect the contemporary relationships between, say, Silicon Valley and big oil and gas. But instead, I'd like to demystify the novelty of big tech and even of fossil fuels and put them into a deeper historical context. So I'm going to draw a little on my home field of feminist political theory and my interest in history to think about these energy masculinities as recurring antagonists across 5 centuries of Western imperial capitalism. This is an imperial formation, I think, that is dying. But dying empires can still be dangerous, especially when they're as heavily armed as this one is. So by looking back at this history, I want to show a continuity, dare I say, a renewability of this logic of domination. But at the same time, in its need to constantly reproduce itself, I hope we can find and see its fragility. And I especially want to highlight the central place of energy in this history, not just as a fuel, but as a political physics of motion that I think is necessary for extractive domination to work. Okay, so a little turn into political theory here, bear with me. I think we all know ecomodernism and green centrism are grounded in liberalism. And the first concern of liberal theorists, going back to the 17th century, was to overthrow the paternal power of kings. So that's in part why it feels so obvious to ecomodernists that they are the enemies of petropatriarchs. So we can go back to this familiar face, Locke, but I want to read him with an eye to energy. Liberals like Locke want to explain how political order could come about not through conquest, but consent, the famous social contract. And why would people consent to be governed? Well, Locke argued that people would rationally consent to government in exchange for the protection of property. Property is at the heart of liberalism, and where does property come from? It starts with the singular possessive self who can claim his body as his property, along with his work. So many critical scholars point out the internal dissonances of liberalism, but as a first feminist side note, I already want to point out that we have a masculinized self, in that this singular owned body whose work and self can be claimed as one's own without any dependency is not ontologically real. However, this ideal of bodily ownership also continues to be important for claims on the left. Think of the feminist chant, "My body, my choice." It's worth remembering, though, that this notion of self-ownership is the basis of Western property logics. The other problem often attributed to Locke is that only European men were sort of fit to make contracts. So now classic books like The Sexual Contract by Carol Pateman, The Racial Contract by Charles Mills explain how this logic was accomplished. Gender and racial domination were naturalized and set outside of civil society and where the contracts are made. So that's why the fairy tale about the birth of the state comes after a story about the family, where male sex right is established as a biological fact, and after a story about the state of nature, where European supremacy is established as an evolutionary fact. So these relations are not part of social contracts, but the problem for liberalism is that those relations can never be fully erased either. Those people are still there doing a lot of social and reproductive work. This is ultimately the fragility, as we all know, of extractive logic, that the elites are not actually independent. They are, in fact, the most dependent of all. So Locke is a familiar guy, but I want to emphasize his energetics here, the commitment to dynamism in this liberal self. The key asset or value of a person is their activity, their work, not even the outcome or the purpose of the work, but the activity itself as creating value. In the primacy of labor as the foundation of freedom, we see an early iteration of the hypermasculinist story of energy: work, dynamism, expansion. Liberalism may have brought down patriarchal kings, but it did not bring down the patriarchy. It innovated a new kind of patriarchal rule, what Carol Pateman calls a fraternal rule of equal brothers under the law. And I think this is a good way to understand the different misogynies of petro-masculinity and ecomodern, a kind of patriarchal and fraternal rule. But can't liberal theory just correct these bad, unfortunate beginnings and extend the idea of equality outward? Not without undoing the man at the heart of its theory, this laboring man and his property. These internal contradictions of liberalism reveal its political purpose, which was a set of theories for European men to overthrow their kings and yet not to undo their own supremacy. And that's a tricky needle to thread. In coming up with this kind of theory to overthrow kings, liberalism did open the door for challenging domination altogether, and that remains its appeal. So, for example, we see this in people who took the claims of the Enlightenment seriously, like Toussaint Louverture in the Haitian Revolution, calling out Europeans for their perjury, for not following the values that they were actually espousing. So I think the interesting thing about this quotation is we see so much cognitive dissonance among the elite today, and it's worth pointing out that this cognitive dissonance goes back quite a while. So overthrowing paternal political power required language that suggested revolutionary outcomes, and this truly alarmed conservatives. In looking at Haiti and these other histories of Western imperialism, it's striking how this Janus-faced rule, the language of equality alongside violent domination, routinely reappears in the guise of two masculine figures who are dueling but also working together. One is a calculating, competitive, visionary man with dreams of innocent, clean power, and the other is a henchman doing the bloody work that the expansion actually requires. So I want to show you a few examples that I picked. One is from David Graeber, who identifies in his book on debt two figures in the early colonization of the Americas, what he calls the adventurer and the financier. Bankers loaned the money to the colonizers, and meanwhile, all of the conquerors and the royals who sent them were deeply in debt. Graeber suggests the shame and anxiety of those debts, which I think is another way of saying dependency, played a role in their genocidal cruelty. Graeber says that relationship between the daring adventurer on the one hand, the gambler willing to take any sort of risk, and on the other, the careful financier, whose entire operations are organized around steady mathematical growth, lies at the very heart of what we now call capitalism. So these figures are, of course, it does violence always to try to draw lines between different figures across history. But I do think we can find some connections and patterns between these figures and ecomodern and petro-masculinity. One man demands profit as a technical procedure, and the other extracts value through blood. Locke himself, of course, has his colonial antithesis. Locke was an investor and a secretary of the Council of Trade and Plantations in North America. He was personally invested in British imperialism. So his theories about this laboring individual didn't come out of nowhere. He was trying to justify the British style of colonialism, which was going to be commercial and peaceful, he claims, as better than the violent conquest of the Catholic Spaniards, the empire that Britain was kind of surpassing. So he says there are two ways of growing rich, conquest or commerce. Again, we see this framed as an antagonism. But meanwhile, Locke knew full well that the colonies were rife with British plunder and massacre of indigenous people. Too many examples to choose from, but this picture from 40 years before Locke wrote his theories is the 1637 massacre of a Pequot village in what is now called Connecticut, which killed hundreds of men, women, and children and burned the village to the ground. And I chose this episode because the British commander of the massacre, John Mason, stated his objective clearly and in direct contrast to Locke: destroy them by sword and save the plunder. Ironically, early colonists relied upon indigenous knowledge and food to survive, but this dependency was always denied. So this pair of masculine figures that we find in the early Iberian conquerors, in the British imperialists, is reflected again among early American colonists. This is a wonderful book by historian Greg Grandin, which won the Pulitzer Prize last year or 2 years ago, called The End of the Myth. What's fascinating about this book is it shows the ongoing tension about expansion among the men involved in defining early America. And Grandin frames this as a debate between the squatters and the squires. So the squatters are those like John Mason, or Grandin tells the story of the Paxton Boys, which sounds quite a lot like today's Proud Boys, who continually raided indigenous lands, sometimes in violation of white law, massacring with abandon. The squires were those who were uncomfortable with, even disgusted by the squatters. They were disgusted and yet fully aware and participants themselves. So here we have a painting of George Washington that offers a romanticized version of his estate and his position as a slave master. Squires like Thomas Jefferson and Washington had investments in Western territory. Their revolutionary anger against King George was not only about unfair British taxes, which is the reason that most American school children learn, like unfair taxation, but about King George's 1763 proclamation that forbid Anglo settlers from crossing the Eastern Continental Divide. Squires hated that. But they had ways to keep their hands unbloodied, Grandin writes, and their visions needed to be enacted by the purposeful violence of the squatters. Locke needed Mason, Jefferson needed the Paxton Boys. These figures, the financier and the adventurer, the peaceful farmer and the plunderer, the squatter and the squire, each is specific to a time and place. And yet there's a through line here in terms of the cognitive dissonance of the logic of settler state domination, I think specifically. And I would add the cognitive dissonance maybe of being a settler consumer today, even flying to this conference, say, and thinking about how I'm justifying that, but it's really fun. I like to see you all in person. Haven't squared that one yet. There's a recurrence of a violent white masculinity partnered with a masculinity that fancies its projects to be progressive. So what's going on with this partnership? Why this desire to claim a clean power, whether it's empty land for settlers to claim, or the idea of 100% clean energy, which is impossible? Why not go the way of the squatters and fascists and just proclaim that might makes right? I can't fully answer that question today, but I want to highlight the function of energy in this story, specifically the desire for dynamism and the political function that dynamism serves. So I've been thinking a lot about degrowth, and with degrowth scholarship on the importance of challenging growth. And here we have just showing, like, even as we add renewables, we just continue to grow in terms of energy consumption. But having written a book about the science of energy, thermodynamics, and this is where I get the idea of dynamics, I think there's another desire going on here that's related to growth, but perhaps conceptually distinct. And that's a commitment not just to growth, which still has this idea of or justified by an outcome, but just to dynamics, to movement, a constant need for novelty, action in itself. So thermodynamics, which emerges in the 19th century, takes up energy as a scientific object for the first time. And before then, the word was mostly philosophical and poetic. And it had even become fairly rare. And I write about this in my book, The Birth of Energy, when scientists of energy adopted this term, energy, to make sense of heat and work and steam engines. They imbued their new science with ancient philosophical connotations that connected energeia, which is Aristotle's term, to virtue. For Aristotle, energeia was active. It was the use of a capacity rather than its mere possession. However, energeia was not just any activity. Things like building a house or sweeping the floor are not energeia, they're just kinetic motion. Aristotle thinks of energeia as activities that are ends in themselves, like activities that are fulfilled in their doing, like thinking or living well. Definitely not work, which is a means to another end. Modern energy picks up Aristotle's belief that goodness was active rather than a static possession, but the place of work at this point in European culture is completely the opposite. Modern energy is all but synonymous with work, both in its scientific meaning and its political application. As we saw with Locke, who was 150 years before thermodynamics emerges, labor was already a central European virtue. So Aristotle excluded work from energeia because it was only a means. It could point toward many ends. By equating energy and work, modern energy valorizes dynamism itself. It becomes its own virtue. And this minimizes questions about the purpose. More energy for what? For who? Which I think Cyril also asked that question in his talk. Even though Aristotle and modern energy scientists took totally opposite positions on work, they do share something important. And that is that there's this kind of desire for a fulfillment that comes through the exercise of energy. And whatever that means, for both Aristotle and later energy scientists, it had this idealized masculine form. So dynamism as a cultural drive says energy is good when it's channeled toward action, and its evil is entropy. Entropy, I think, is the real death drive here. The increasing diffusion of energy, which means this is a kind of energy that can do less work, also sometimes coded as waste, sometimes called, in the big money world, inflation. Life is just little eddies of low entropy that are briefly protected from this larger river of entropic increase, which runs toward disorder, decay, and death. The death drive is naturalized here by energy physics as the decaying force of the cosmos. This is kind of like the fallen nature, the degrading friction that wears our bodies and our projects down. The desire for energy is driven by an urgency to take control of pockets of quote unquote useful energy, useful to humans, to use them before they too are lost in this one-way stream. And this is how you get to describing a waterfall as wasteful when it's not being caught by a mill, or a desert as wasteful with all the sun falling to the ground and not hitting solar panels. In this logic, nature is wholly subject to entropy, and women too are entropic, as are racialized and queer bodies. These entropic bodies are both terrifying as forces of chaos, but at the same time, they're weak and in need of oversight because of their disordered energy. The joy of the fascist urge doesn't promise to defeat entropy or even to avoid it, but to steer it, at least for a moment, to be in charge of your own entropic increase rather than to sit and be dissipated. This preference for dynamism infects the right, neoliberals, ecomoderns. It infuses the left too, visible in the elevation of activism, urgency, movements, sometimes with impatience for slower pursuits and smaller pursuits, like thinking, the everyday banality of care work, as opposed to explosive acts like blowing up pipelines. It appears sometimes too in the sense of urgency around climate action, to do something and do it big in the timelines that keep getting shorter, even as they push into the future. Indigenous scholar Kyle Powys-White has taught me to see how the commitment to urgency can be harmful and can override questions of justice. Like when green projects and green advocates get frustrated when demands of marginalized communities slow them down. The work of repairing relations is sorely needed, Powys-White says, but that's often slow work, building trust, especially after trust has been so decimated. So I've talked a lot about the desire for dynamism, how it can feel like sexy and fulfilling, but it's also important to recognize the political function of dynamism, because this highlights, I think, the vulnerable place for extractive logics. So dynamism, yes, is a fulfillment, a theological commitment even. Energy is sacred, entropy is evil. But politically speaking, dynamism, I think, is also a running away from what is felt as the shame of dependency. And it's shameful only because it's unreciprocated. Just as profits accumulate, so too does this shame for elites. And you can see this, I think, in the hypersensitivity right now of white supremacists in the US to the idea of guilt. So even as we are here, books are being banned in US schools according to whether they make people feel guilty. This is the shame of enormous unpaid debts, not the debts that are often talked about in terms of climate debt, students, global south, regions, but the debts of the masters who extract from other people and yet still depend upon them. Dynamism is a way to run away from debt, to stay one step ahead of those overdue payments. by distraction, by future promises, by war, by violence. Dynamism through work, especially. Work and war that doesn't need to end even in any given product or useful thing or success, but just has to happen, is a solution to problems that can't be solved within political systems that remain committed to the fixity of private property, the one thing that cannot move. You don't have to look far to see this function of growth expressed quite explicitly in the founding documents, for example, of the US. So James Madison, this is a famous kind of American political text, the Federalist 10. He's writing 100 years after Locke, and he says the main problem is factions for the early republic. And yeah, you might fight about religion or education, but the worst division is going to be about property. So those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. And liberty, because liberalism is about the protection of property, liberalism can't solve this problem of haves and have-nots. It can only try to mitigate it. The surest way, Madison and many others realized, is to, quote, extend the sphere, to make the republic larger so that it's harder for a faction to band together and, quote, execute their plans of oppression. So this is a very conscious political strategy. It's notable that when Madison gives examples of plans of oppression, they're mostly about property, improper or wicked projects like the abolition of debt or equal division of property. Expansion ever since has been the drive of the US, from the 19th century war with Mexico to the war in Iraq. The arrival of fossil fuels only accelerated this project of freedom as constant movement. Nothing even has to grow, per se. It just has to keep moving. Energy functions as both material and symbol in this project of dynamism. It's the fuel that provides hot movement, but it's also a symbol of virility and freedom as dynamism. The struggle against energy masculinity will involve dealing with these questions of dependency and property and work. And questions of property and work are very familiar to Marxists, but there still is on the left, as much as anywhere, this seduction of dynamism, treasuring action over, say, the quality of relations at times. And the answer can't be to double down on the opposite, slowness instead of urgency, entropic chaos instead of ordered energy. I think that's a temptation on the left too. Instead, it's to be aware of the seduction of movement and what the movement is for. And it is to try to move only for better relations, but not to move to escape dependency. So for example, I think we see this in the sentiment that energy independence is a good thing, and that appears on the right and the left, as if the independence is the thing in itself to be celebrated, rather than thinking about how to make dependent relations better. Feminists tell us that dependency is not utopia. It's our everyday life. It comes with accountability and sticky connections, and as Lauren Berlant says in the title of her new book, the inconvenience of others. But it can come with pleasure and care and pride too. It doesn't have to be filled with shame. Shame is the way dependency feels within an extractive regime. And so the best diagnostic, I think, of whether any energy project is just or sustainable is, does this plan face those wicked demands of debt abolition or property? Does it bring energy for profit to pay back big money loans, because most renewable energy is privately financed? Or is it what we owe to those upon whom we depend? Is that why we're adding or building energy? For those in the global north, to face their debts, to pay what they owe, would be frightening. It forces people to inhabit the present space and time instead of the constantly moving out future. It poses questions of reparation and sufficiency, and the panic at that prospect explains the mania to take charge of the twin death drives of fascism and endless growth all the way to Mars. So in the steam era of the 19th century America, energy expansion was explicitly called a safety valve. It was intended to release the pressure of public discontent that was building in the cities in the East, and especially after the Civil War with newly enfranchised Black citizens, to put off political demands for another day. And I think so it remains. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for an eloquent and generative talk. Let's see if I can find mine. We found out during an enjoyable evening earlier this week, Cara and I, that we share, apart from research interests in common, we both also live in co-housing. And I must say that in terms of the interests we share, one thing that's been different is the path we've taken towards them. So my trajectory starts from India, goes via Denmark and Italy, Germany, the US, the UK to Norway. And I'm an associate professor here at the University of Stavanger, and then a professor too in the University of Bergen at the Center for Climate and Energy Transformation. And I work with the research group called Sustainability Transformation on the governance of energy transitions. So today I respond to a talk that prompted me to do something I don't often do, which is to write down and read aloud. I respond as an energy social scientist with interdisciplinary roots in development studies, political ecology, and human geography. I will offer 3 takeaways that energy social scientists with an anchoring in these disciplines and cognate ones may find fruitful to engage with. And with each of these vantage points, I will raise a question that speaks back to the important themes that you have drawn out. First, I offer reflections as a development researcher. An emphasis on labor and property is natural in feminist energy scholarship to problematize power relations and inequitable resource allocation. In 2003, Jesse Rebo and Nancy Peluso articulated bundles of power as, quote, a set of relationships through which people and their institutions realize benefits from things, unquote. One could understand property as being a particular set of arrangements in various configurations to realize benefits based on rights. These scholars theorize access as being secured through something distinct from rights, namely through structural and relational mechanisms such as gender, access to social networks, capital, and technology. So there is a refined understanding of how actors and institutions realize these benefits, and of how they apply powers of exclusion in a book by Derek Hall, Philip Hirsch, and Tanya Lee back in 2011 to keep benefits from accruing to other actors. In their work from 2009, Thomas Sikor and Christian Lund have further explored the relationship between access and property as one that plays out between power and authority, where authority is legitimated power, where they approach the two as mutually constitutive. They thus maintain a focus on rights, while inserting a focus on enforcement and claim-making as relational processes through which power dynamics unfold. So bringing an epistemological understanding of labor and work into this conceptual debate is most welcome, as it draws attention to the core worldviews that motivate social organization, and it helps to mobilize and to orchestrate specific shifts in orientation. Asking who gets to define the value of work and the basis of property and why enables valuable insight into who has power, how it is exercised, at the service of which overarching concerns. Too often, as you have shown, these concerns are to preserve the incumbent power and privilege of elites. Engaging with questions of labor, work, and how these interact with property at more abstract levels is a useful complement to the developed focus on property and land use change during accelerating green transitions, which is a scholarly enterprise that development researchers can bring much to. Energy social science has been slow in engaging with this seasoned scholarship. From development studies, then, I ask a question of you. As a feminist political theorist with an interest in historicization, you focus on the global north. As a development researcher working explicitly in and across global north and south contexts, I'm acutely conscious of the lack of common epistemology due to diverse cultural histories, legacies, and contexts across countries and peoples. Surely Aristotle or Locke, while familiar names in places like India, have not launched concepts that inscribe the meaning of energy in the minds of Indians nor do the Chinese view ongoing energy transitions principally through a Jeffersonian lens. While the birth of energy may have been dominated by a white masculine origin, how can contemporary analyses of the driving forces of energy transitions account for more globalized, diverse epistemic underpinnings? So while acknowledging your demarcation as a scholar studying the global north, I wonder whether the choice to refrain from engagement with some of the political geographies where energy transitions are accelerating in rather contrasting contexts necessitates some caveats and limits of scope to these claims. Next, I speak from political ecology. I'm convinced of your argument that ecomodernism comprises part of the push for renewable energy rollout, and that it shares some masculinities with petrocultural epochs. This is, in a sense, inevitable, as renewable energy sources expand within the conditions of emergence that existing political economies allow for. Timothy Mitchell's incredible book, Carbon Democracy, which we share as a favorite, is a go-to treatise on how the socio-materiality of energy sources interplays with societies, each shaping the other in a recursive relationship. I would add to this the deeply insightful book Remaking Berlin by another Timothy Moss. Over the span of a full century, this unpacks infrastructural change across shifting urban political regimes in the same city to argue for the deeply path-dependent but also political nature of infrastructural change. But what these works equally point us to is that eco-modern motivations are only a slice of a larger story about the advent of renewable energy. Not all of it can be rightly categorized as expansionist. Rather, there are twists and turns. Granted that the overwhelming share of renewable energy capacity additions are at large scales, but there's no dearth of examples of community energy projects that are not only emerging but multiplying, of aggregators that are serving as intermediaries for modular logics to scale up within, admittedly still capitalist markets. A personal favorite is the work of the New York State Renewable Energy Development Authority on pro-poor solar rollout, which we are trying to emulate in 4 European countries, and which is being scaled up both rapidly and massively. So here I wish to make 2 points about the agency of infrastructure as a staple of both political ecologists and of science and technology studies scholars. On the one hand, one can regard the rollout of renewable energy as a shift away from the logic of fossil fuel infrastructure to modular infrastructure, which more easily lends itself to spatial distribution, and which layers on to existing infrastructures like transmission grids in a mind-boggling multiplicity of ways that make fossil fuels look very 20th century. This layering unlocks real-time coordination across sectors to an extent that means that the country we are in has data infrastructures to inform us about building-level consumption and consumption of electricity across Norway with a pulse of just a few minutes, to price electricity flows and plan electricity infrastructure based on such information, and to plan ahead for low-carbon energy systems that cut across sectors, are sensibly priced, and can optimize resource use. The current mismanagement of electricity system markets in Norway shows that this is not an error-free process, but my point stands that this layering of infrastructure atop existing systems holds promise in the longue durée. On the other hand, it would be premature to dismiss renewable energy rollout as mere expansionism, because destabilizing hegemonic systems like fossil fuel infrastructure is an uphill struggle that goes slow before it can go fast. And there's reason to believe that we're about to go very fast. Last year, Portugal, where I carry out long-term ethnographic work on solar transitions, shut its last remaining coal thermal plant 9 years earlier than its own commitment as part of the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Rapid rollout of solar energy, first at large, but increasingly also at smaller scales, has been key. It is worth thinking about practices of displacement. Along with my friends and colleagues Jakob Grandin and Howard Harstad at the Center for Climate and Energy Transformation in Bergen, I suggest that there are 4 such practices: discursive, financial, infrastructural, and institutional. These deserve closer study. So my question to you here, as much as to the audience, is twofold. If we agree that renewable energy rollout is characterized by renewable masculinities reminiscent of their fossil fuel counterparts, how can our analyses do justice to counter-hegemonic agency, to what Arjun Appadurai in 2004 termed the capacity to aspire? And relatedly, how can we as scholars enable aspirations with feminist sensibilities to let 1,000 energy transition flowers bloom? in avoidance of what Andy Sterling in his 2019 article cautioned against when asking, how deep is incumbency? Finally, let me speak as a human geographer. We come to dynamism, which I see as the conceptual centerpiece of your talk. Human, and particularly urban geographers, have long discussed this as metabolism, which gathers relevance as space-time compresses and accelerates in particular places, such as cities. I laud your talk for its work in situating concepts in deeper, enduring legacies, evoking affect, and for working beyond the binary of growth, degrowth to the distinct concept of dynamism. It is important to distinguish it from dynamics, which attract considerable attention in energy transition studies. You problematize dynamism as a tool of distraction and a coping strategy, distracting unwitting publics away from the reproduction of masculinities that have long made them suffer during fossil capitalism, and helping elites cope with the guilt of sustaining inegalitarianism and the risk of losing control and thus their privilege. I wonder, however, if dynamism is a more ambiguous concept akin to metabolism in human geography. Urban studies scholars worry about cities speeding up resource throughput, but they also marvel at the clustering effects of cities in generating rapid traction for ideas and action. I empathize with your comments about Elon Musk, but am forced to acknowledge that when he visits Stavanger next week, there is a queue of anxious hypermasculinity throwing money at the spectacle of experiencing him talk, because his talk holds the power to move much more money towards the ideals he espouses. Here is an image from a campaign that local battery company Easy launched in a bid to meet this man. Metabolism on steroids, as it were. While it is impressive to rustle up a decent turnout on a Saturday morning for a public keynote, academic events today do not inflect the zeitgeist with the same force. All this to say that we need to channel dynamism at the service of the ideals and actions we espouse based on informed analysis and reflection, and that scholars are not winning the cultural legitimation battle. If dynamism is to be a helpful heuristic in this respect, we must treat its potency with care. So I turn to two works that your invocation of dynamism brought to mind. One by Daniel Kahneman on the merits of thinking at multiple temporalities, and the other by Gordon Walker on the challenge of transforming our everyday dependencies on energy systems into new rhythmic patterns that are more attuned to just, decent energy living. Do you entertain a kernel of hope for dynamism to lend itself to espousing nobler aims for this urgent project of rapid change, with an orientation quite the converse of energy masculinities? Is there scope for accelerating metabolisms to synchronize slow thinking with requisite fast action? I close with a photo from Western India's Thar Desert from fieldwork last summer. We desperately need just energy transitions to work. Thank you. Let's come back on stage. We have compressed time compared to what we expected. So I invite questions from the floor to Cara.
Or you. Or to Sid. That was great. Thanks, Sid.
No questions today? You asked a few questions, didn't you?
I did.
Sid, maybe you want to give a counter comment on some of the things that he said.
Yeah, I know. And they were really wonderful questions too, and rich. Maybe I'll just take up the last one about dynamism and metabolism, which interestingly, the early science of metabolism was kind of a feeder into the science of energy, and they're really connected. And so I think similarly to dynamism, there's room to critique, not dismiss, but critique the way that metabolism can lend itself to kind of a quantification of input and output, bringing ecology into this sort of systemic study that can sometimes miss more of the nuances. So for dynamism, I would say the first thing that came to mind is I'm in a political science department. So we're divided between people who do humanities-based work, like all of us, or humanities-oriented social science, and people who work with data, who work mostly with voting data and do statistical analysis. And I feel that colleagues in this room, we start with a problem, and then we sort of decide what kinds of methodology or what kinds of tools we might use to answer the question we have. And I feel like among my colleagues, the method is all. So you start with the tool and then decide, what can I do with this tool? And so I guess I have a similar feeling about dynamism, wherein I'm not saying there's no use for data, numbers, statistics, but I want it to be you first to say, well, what are we doing, and is it useful for that? And to recognize when it's not. Which I think is the books that you mentioned were really in that vein of not of kind of appreciating rhythm.
Yes. There's a hand.
I have a question about the
Could you please start by introducing?
Yes, my name is Benjamin Steininger. I'm based in Berlin and Vienna. And I have a question about the dynamism as something. I understood it like this only feeds then in the logic of rationality and being more effective. But there's this other side, the excess, and this is something like a counter story of reinvestment of money and energy and so on. So the excess, where does that play into your view on the dynamism?
Yeah, I think there's a deeper question there that you're asking about efficiency. Also, interestingly, the concept of efficiency is born with the science of energy. They're so tightly linked. And efficiency is interesting because it has both of these sides to it, where on the one hand, there's kind of a conservation side to efficiency, like use as little as possible to get the most out of what you have so you don't have to use as much. But efficiency always also has this effect of like, the more efficient you are, the more, the Jevons paradox, right? The more efficient you are, the more you will use and use and use. And it sort of fuels an expansionary thinking and an excessive thinking. So that's one way to answer it. Another way might be to see this thing I was trying to do to think about two kinds of death drives. So there's the one that sort of has to sort of promise or have an idea of progress or growth, kind of the way like a lot of Silicon Valley firms don't actually make money, but they say they make. There's a lot of emptiness behind that. But still there's this need for like effect and effective action. But then there's a death drive that's kind of in excess, I think is what you're getting at. That's a just knowingly destructive and not needing that kind of point. But what I want to say is they're not antagonists.
Another hand over here.
Hi, I'm Alexander Klaus. I'm actually a partner of Benjamin in the research collective Beauty of Oil. Thank you for your great talks. And I'm actually taking up your objection that maybe it's too focused, this story or this analysis is too focused on UK, English, American conquering of the world. So I would like to ask back first about Catholic approaches, so to say. I mean, this is the Protestant hegemony, so to say, from Max Weber to to liberalism. But there always also existed Catholic European hegemonic countries, and then of course there was communism, socialism, and there was like petro-modernities East. And though, of course, dynamics and so on also play a role there, but still I wonder if you can, if the image stays that consistent, you know, starting with John Locke, and then you have like diversions, and one diversion would be Karl Marx and Lenin especially, and then the Soviet Union and their way of extractivism and exploitation and so on, and colonialism, of course. So how do you, I mean, and I think it's necessary, of course, that we try to tell all these stories and put them upon each other at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's a really fair challenge. I would say that my aim is in the vein of provincializing a logic that claims to be scientific and universal and a reflection of human nature. Sort of like sorry, it's hard to think on my feet so early in the morning. So I certainly, and in my book, I also don't go into any great detail, but really the urge of it is to say this is a specific logic, and therefore there are many other ways of thinking about and valuing energy. And yeah, I don't do that work in the book. So I take your point. I think I'm really inspired by and cognizant of a global studies that thinks the world always in relation. So I also don't want to do the thing of saying, well, there's this energy thing over here that's different, and that's the one that we should use, because I think at this point in our history, there are different ways of doing energy, but they've all been in conversation with each other. So I think that work needs to be done. And I think there's still some value, I guess, for me. I sort of take up the call from, Black Lives Matter, for example, to white people in the US, like, go fix your white people. I don't want to be lazy in doing that and saying that, sort of centering that. But at the same time, I still see that logic as really dominant and destructive. And I think it has to be put into its context in order to be dethroned, right? So I guess I take the critique as a fair one and say that's why we're a lot of people doing this work, and not just little old me can do it. And the other thing I would add is that wait, what was you asked something else related about the different Western traditions. Even you're exactly right. Like, even for example, within energy science, there's so much to be done with the German tradition that was distinct from the Scottish Presbyterian one. So there's a violence that's done with this kind of like big picture thinking that I'm doing. Any kind of drawing of a pattern is really a violent move. And I think it's a story, it's a fiction that I just told. But as long as we always keep in mind it's a fiction and we play with it as a toy and feel free to be like, this isn't fun anymore, or then I think maybe it's okay. Like, to me, that's kind of what historiography can do. As long as we always remember it's incomplete, it's violent, it's based on my own personal ignorances and position, right? Maybe not a satisfying answer.
Thank you very much. I'm Katie Ritston from the Rachel Carson Centre. And this is a question that's been bothering me, and it came up in the slide you showed of the trucker protests with the people on foot next to it. And it's just a very clear expression of that powerlessness against the kind of the power of the big trucks. And thinking about the eroticism and desire of the two different forms of masculinity in their different ways. I wonder whether you think there is any way in which the protest movement, the on-foot protest movement, Black Lives Matter and the women's movement, and all of those non-technicized protest movements can be infused with any kind of desire or pleasure, or whether it's always a kind of masochism, because it's always a love that comes from not power or from dependency. Is there a way of turning that into something that's also has desire and pleasure in it, or is it the pleasure that comes of kind of from masochism, from powerlessness?
So you're saying the erotics of being on the street and not being powerful.
Can there be an erotics of being on the street and not being powerful that isn't masochism? I want there to be, but I'm not sure where to find it.
I don't know about you, but I have felt very erotically moved by being on the street. So yes, I think so. And I also think that masochism is part of petro-masculinity. The sort of like subordination to a leader is part of the joy and thrill of it, not just having power, but giving your power to some sort of great, all-powerful Putin, Trump figure is also a masochism. I don't know that it's a masochism being on the street, though, because I think being on the street, you're powerless, but you're also, the erotics is like the contact that you're having with others that you don't get from being in a truck. So I think that's an erotics of gathering, maybe.
I would chip in with a very
Yeah,
local,
please.
soft example. If after this session you turn left out of this building and walk 5 minutes to a square called Newtork, you'll see the local farmers market that was being laid out as we got here. And that's another way of being out on the street that has some convivial properties that are quite attractive.
Yeah.
There's a hand up here.
Yeah, thank you so much for beginning to unravel all those different eco-masculinities. And I just have a note from the Czech Republic. I looked at adverts, and one of a very prevalent way is the hipster man cradling children in nature. So you adopt renewable solar for the family as a means of family care. And at the same time, speaking to some of these men, you encounter this somewhat surprising vulnerabilities. And that's the question part, an ethics of vulnerability advocated by people like Stacey Alaimo in her early work on the carbon footprint of gender. If you have any thoughts on that. So I'm thinking about the fear of electricity, the fear of the magnetic field impacting on my bodily hormones and so on. So the fear of low voltage electricity in the house and so on. So very surprising. You know, you were talking about the cracks in those dominant hyper masculinities. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the vulnerability is coming from an awareness of dependency and this idea that dependency is something bad. And I think it is bad in this specific system we live in, but it doesn't have to be bad. So the vulnerability, I think, is scary because you can't count on other people always because of how we've set ourselves up. So I think that is the root in, is that is through dependency. And that's why when I see masculinity, that's what I want to emphasize is this fear of dependency. And how can we build systems that honor dependency rather than, I even see this so much in among Greens that I work with, is like this desire to be like, our own grid and our like really self-sufficient and really hyper-local sometimes can start to be because of a fear of a really valid fear, given the way things are. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but to me, the kind of multi-scalar work that Sid does, it kind of dismisses that there can be some real value in that if we're thinking about dependency as something that could be really security giving instead of vulnerability making, right?
So we'll take one final question from Marian, possibly.
Thank you so much for your lectures. Very evocative for me. And just one comment on alternative eco-masculinities. There's I've been observing an electric bike masculinity that's evolving. If you would just watch any kind of YouTube and you Google some kind of electric bike, it's up in the market. So, and there's lots of videos of lots of men explaining and, drooling over the technology there. So I think it is a very interesting thing to observe how there's some, and I've been kind of wondering, is this intentionally somebody thinking we need to do this in order to make energy transition possible, or is it something that's just kind of organically evolving? And I don't know. I think it could be both. But that's just a comment. And I was struck by your comment on energy as sacred and entropy as evil. It's something that's struck me also, and how many of our concepts of God or the sacred or divinity are centered around kind of energy and power, right? And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that question, or further thoughts that you might have, and especially the entropy as evil, right? So, because Augustine would say evil is the deprivation of the good, so it's an absence, right? And so, is the good? Can we get out of more energy all the time? Is always ever better and divine and sacred? I was very struck by that. If you could just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Well, I think we could, and this is where different energy epistemologies do come in. Like in the book, I talk about all kinds of threads of thinking about change and a dynamism and action, from everything from, Tao, where there's the evil and the good and the evil, and there's not a sense of this binary, or prana, or the Stoics, where we're not talking about a Christian omnipotent singular universal God. And I think that's part of how you can start to then conceptualize away from a binary of nothing infinite or evil sacred. So yes. And then I guess I'm going to bring it back to Sid's last question about, like, we're losing the culture, is it geist, with like how sexy e-bikes are, which I think it's a good thing, and how boring our academic talks are for Saturday. Like, no one's queuing up, like, for me, like Elon Musk will have. I think this is a serious, really, really important point. And I think part of it is that environmentalists get put in this corner of asceticism and sacrifice. Even the thing around that I said kind of half jokingly about flying, there's a lot of, like, in terms of shame, I think we feel that, and there's a lot of that emotion and things about personal sacrifice that the broader public imagines is what it means to care about the climate or be an environmentalist. And it's simply not sexy to say, like, this is the answer, is you all need to, like, really monitor yourself and put an energy meter in and, think about all your consumer choices. This is, like, when I've been on podcasts with more activists, they're always like, these are always the questions. It's always about this. So I don't have the answer, but I don't strategically and tactically, I think we need to get away from that. So conviviality, like, I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah, maybe building on that first comment you had there about the e-bikes. This afternoon, going with the trend of local examples, from 2 to 4, there's a gathering at Tausena, which is another popular local place, where there are cargo bicycles. And these are people who opt out of having car dependency in a supercar dependent city, and gather every year or so with some municipal support to talk to people about how they make their lives work outside of automobility. So to me, that is a counter-hegemonic agency example. And I guess the brings me back in closing to my second question to you, as it were, which is about how do we, from sort of the space of academia, champion counter-hegemonic agency? How do we espouse feminist sensibilities in the kind of agency that there are many good, even if incomplete, examples of? And I'm curious because your work on petro-masculinity has been so impactful, and I know that you've thought about this. Are there ways in your academic practice and in our academic practice that we can be a force for counter-hegemonic agency?
Where I've come to this is feeling that everyone figures out what is the thing that they're really good at that they can bring and offer. And I don't even think it's the same for all of us. So I've felt like maybe the thing I might offer is finding concepts or words that activists could pick up or that could really mobilize people or could, this is the classic academic idea, but I think there's also academics who are really good at organizing, and there's academics who are really involved in a community and are scholar activists. And so I think it's just multiple ways of doing that. But in terms of the feminism, what to me the promise of feminist and anti-racist work is always the elements of conviviality and pleasure that go with that the idea of caring for each other, the idea of pointing out what people are actually missing and hurting, and why we're not just saying give up things, but we're actually saying we're building better things. To me, I find a lot of resources for that in feminism.
Thank you. Petroculturists, let's give another round of warm applause to Cara Daggett.
Let's go back.